We're going to move on to our next presenter. I want to apologize to the people who came in late because you didn't actually come in late. We started early. I allocated 30 minutes for opening remarks, but I was the only speaker, and no one wanted to hear me talk for that long. So we started about 15 minutes early, which is good because we're going to have a lot of time for questions and discussion. I also want to apologize that we apparently underestimated the attendance, and that's a good thing, except that some of you are sitting on the floor or standing, so I'm sorry about that. But thank you all for coming. I'm Dr. Andrew Fisher. I'm the chair of the Tyler Lecture Committee, and we've just heard one speaker, Dr. Buck Woodard. I'm now going to introduce our second speaker, Dr. Brenda Child of the University of Minnesota. Brenda Child is Red Lake Ojibwe and Northrop Professor of American Studies at the University of Minnesota. In 2021, she was the university's recipient of the President's Community Engaged Scholar Award. She was recently named a Guggenheim Fellow, which is kind of a big deal. Child is the author of several award-winning books, including Boarding School Seasons, American Indian Families, 1900 to 1940, which students in my Historian's Craft class read this semester. Holding Our World Together, Ojibwe Women and the Survival of Community, from Penguin in 2012, and My Grandfather's Knocking Sticks, Ojibwe Family Life and Labor on the Reservation, from MHS Press in 2014. And I think all of those are available for sale out there until 2. So the bookstore staffer is only there until 2 if you want to buy one of the books and get it signed. The fry bread truck is here all day. So if you haven't already noticed it, Hungry Hungry Arrow, which is Mattapani owned, is out there in the parking lot. And I don't know how much batter they have, so I'm just saying, sooner than later. But back to Dr. Child's impressive resume. Her new book project is The Marriage Blanket, Love, Violence, and the Law in Indian Country. She has a popular documentary, Jingle Dress Dancers in the Modern World, Ojibwe People and Pandemics, produced in 2020, and also authored a bilingual book for children, which she reports is her first bestseller, Bow Wow Pow Wow, which we should have gotten for this, but did not. That won the American Indian Youth Literature Medal. Child is part of a committee developing a new constitution for the 15,000-member Red Lake Ojibwe Nation. Please join me in welcoming her here.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Andy, and also thank you for organizing and being part of a committee to think about the history of the Brafferton School and to think about the history of Indian education. I really am enjoying my visit very much, and I loved your talk, Buck, because years ago when I was in graduate school, in those days we used to write master's thesis. And so I was always interested in this topic of the history of Indian education. And so I wrote my master's thesis at the time on Indian education in colonial Virginia. And I remember looking at the records of the Virginia Company of London and thinking about these various institutions and what the ideas were. I was curious about why education was such an important part of the whole colonization of North America. So I read what people had to say about Indian education. I read what people had to say about Indians. It was very interesting to me. And I think all of those ideas kind of shaped a lot of, I was kind of familiar with a lot of the kind of rhetoric about educating Indians. And a lot of that helped me out because later on I decided to write a dissertation in graduate school about more recent decades, looking at the late 19th and early 20th century. And things were not so terribly far apart, right? I always knew there was kind of an underlying agenda about Indian education, and I think that's what doing that work a long time ago on colonial Virginia taught me. So we're going to move ahead a few decades and centuries and talk about Indian education and especially the era that I focused on, which is actually the early 20th century. And I will just kind of apologize as I get going. I was telling folks yesterday that I was traveling in March and I was in northern Sweden and it was very wintry there and I kind of picked up a cold, so I still have a lingering cough from my travels last month. And I feel fine and everything, but I still kind of cough once in a while, so apologize if I start coughing a little bit. So I think what I'll do, maybe, now do we want to end at 2 o'clock, Indy, for this session, or what are we thinking?
Yeah,
When do we want to start Q&A?
we have until 2:30 actually.
Okay, so I'll just
Yeah.
take my time and then we'll take time for the Q&A too. And you know, I always feel like I need a few moments to kind of warm my brain up to different subjects, and today is no exception. And so I'll show you a few photographs that were kind of important to me, and it will help me get thinking about our topic today about boarding school history. So this was a very important photograph to me in my interest in the history of Indian education. And so this is a photograph of what was called the Oorang Indian football team, taken in the early 1920s. And this photograph was kind of part of a collage of family photographs on my grandmother's wall, framed and on her wall. And I was one of those, I don't know, nosy children, always asking questions about everything and wanted to know. I was curious about our family and especially about relatives who weren't around any longer. So I asked elders, including my grandmother, a lot of questions. So I said, you know, what's this photograph all about, Grandma? And she said, Carlisle, boarding school. When I was like a little kid, you know, probably like 6 or 7 years old, something like that. And so that's the first time I heard someone say Carlisle, boarding school. And I thought, well, that kind of stayed with me. I remember that day when she was telling me about this photograph. And she told me that there's an interesting person in this photograph in the center, in the back row, and that was Jim Thorpe. And then another interesting person was the third one over, who was my great-grandfather from Red Lake. And he was one of the early people from Red Lake to go away to the Carlisle Indian School. And that was my grandma's dad. And he had passed away before I was born, but she told me kind of a lot of stories about him. And I knew, you know, where his fish camp was located on the reservation. I knew that he spoke Ojibwe. I knew that he was a member of the Meday Society, which is the traditional religion of Ojibwe people. And so I kind of thought, well, that's really interesting in later years, because a lot of things I learned about boarding school was all that was taken away from us, you know? And Grandpa seemed to represent to me a very, you know, Ojibwe-speaking, traditional Ojibwe person from our reservation community. So that stayed with me as I started to do my own work later on in the history of Indian education. What I came to find then in later years is this photograph was actually a sports team in the early days of professional football in the United States that Jim Thorpe had organized, and it was composed mostly of people that he knew from Carlisle. Because when I would look at this picture, boarding school, Carlisle, I thought, these guys are old. These are not, you know, like my idea of young people in boarding school. Why are they, you know, so I had a few questions about this photograph. And then later on, I was in fact just talking to my colleague James, writing in about my cousin. We have a mutual, he has a friend and my cousin Jerry, who's kind of one of the oldest cousins of my generation. A few years ago, we were cleaning out what was actually my parents' home. They'd passed away, and we were cleaning out their home on the reservation. And the place where they lived, not the actual house, but my mother had grown up there in a different house that my grandparents had built when they were kind of a young married couple. And so there was a lot of kind of family history in that location. And when we were cleaning out this house, it was like, it's like such a terrible task. Like, you have to go through photographs, and there are all these bad like 70s photographs that are fading, that just like out of focus. And we're like, we don't need these anymore. And I came across a white envelope, just a plain little white envelope. And I almost tossed it, but I decided to open it. And this photograph was inside. And I thought, why have I never seen this photograph before? Obviously, Jim Thorpe and a few more Orang Indian football players. And I didn't know where, it obviously had belonged to my great-grandfather, right? And this was a picture of his friends. And so I thought, it was kind of a cool picture. And I know, looking at the history of the various schools, when I ended up doing research and decided to write my dissertation in grad school years ago when I was just a young scholar in my 20s, I knew that sports were a big part of the boarding school history, and I knew about the school bands, and I knew about Carlisle, and so forth. But I was really quite interested in the school that my own grandmother attended. Her name was Jeanette Aganash, after she married my grandfather, Jeanette Aganash. And she had attended, her dad, who'd gone to Carlisle, sent her to boarding school when she was a young woman, and he sent her to a school in the Midwest that a lot of Ojibwe and Dakota people attended, and that was the Flandreau Indian School, right across the border from Minnesota and South Dakota. So she told me about her experience in boarding school. And again, my grandmother spoke Ojibwe as her first language. Even when I was growing up, she didn't entirely converse in English or Ojibwe. She always kind of had this mix, of the language. And she, to me, also represented, a traditional, she was a jingle dress dancer. She spoke Ojibwe. She raised my mother and all her siblings in the Ojibwe language. And so I just had this different view of boarding school, I think, because of my own family's experience, that they returned to their reservation community, they resumed their lives as Ojibwe people, and everything kind of associated with that. But that was where I first learned about boarding school history, was from my grandmother, Jeanette Aganash. And I'll just kind of start my kind of more formal, now that I've warmed up my brain a little bit, I'll start my kind of formal remarks. So many of us were kind of stunned to see the news that came out of Canada a couple years ago, that the remains of hundreds of Indigenous children were found at former residential schools. And there was kind of a national dialogue taking place in Canada, and we know that dialogue has been going on for years. But for a lot of people in the United States, this information that there is a kind of a comparable system of Indian education was somewhat surprising. In June of 2021, Interior Secretary Deb Haaland, who, like most American Indians, has ancestors who attended government boarding schools, outlined her department's plans to review, quote, the troubled legacy of federal boarding school policies. So, as a historian and a descendant of Ojibwe grandparents who attended these schools at the height of the assimilation movement, I've had many conversations over the years with people in my community, students, about this complex period. When I was doing my early research, when I was a young scholar in my 20s, many of the people, like my grandmother and her generation, were still around to talk to, right? They had attended boarding school during these assimilation years. And so I talked to folks in our community. Sometimes I would ask my grandmother or my mother even to facilitate conversations with people. I would say, such and such went to boarding school. I see them in the records. Do you think they would talk to me? And sometimes people were happy to talk to me about their boarding school experiences. And then sometimes people weren't willing to kind of talk to me. And I had to kind of wonder about, I knew that sometimes people, from beginning to look at the boarding school records, had terrible experiences in government boarding schools. But at other times, my mother suggested to me, and I thought this was revealing too, that sometimes people had difficult family circumstances when they were children, and they were sent to boarding school. And so bringing up this also was kind of a bad memory for them of their childhood and the difficult experiences. So some of the problems Native people were facing at the time, were multiple. It wasn't just boarding schools, but for us in the Great Lakes and in Ojibwe country, this was the big era of dispossession. And not so much us in Red Lake, who never allotted our reservation, but for every other Indian community in especially Wisconsin, Minnesota, the Dakotas, they were going through this period in the kind of post-allotment era where they were losing their land. In fact, this is the story of my grandfather, who was a Mille Lacs Ojibwe person from central Minnesota. And those communities were being forced out by the state of Minnesota in the early 20th century. So my grandfather, his brother, and his dad all left Mille Lacs and went up to the White Earth Reservation. And they said, this is going to be the homeland of all you Ojibwe people. You can go live up there and take your allotment. So they did that. But what my grandfather found, who did not speak English, he was Ojibwe speaking, was that eventually his allotment was taken away from him for non-payment of taxes. And my grandfather, probably didn't know too much about taxes, but he also, later on, of course, people acknowledged that was illegal, that native land shouldn't be taken for non-payment of taxes. And so there was a whole, Native people were really dealing with a lot of land fraud, a lot of dispossession, and it was a very difficult period for Indian people in not just the late 19th century, but going on into the first couple of decades of the 20th century. Fortunately for us, my grandfather had fallen in love with my grandmother, who was 20 years younger than him and fresh back from boarding school. And he was like 40 and she was 23, and they ended up getting married and having a family. So my grandfather had his first children in his 40s. And this is why we're all Red Lakers, is because my grandmother, we didn't lose our land at Red Lake. And my mom and all her siblings and our family live on the Red Lake Ojibwe Reservation in northern Minnesota. So anyway, as a historian, like I said, when the news came out from Canada a couple years ago, people began asking me, does the United States need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to address our history? The discovery of mass graves of children in Canada had shocked many people. And for them, boarding schools were kind of a distant and relatively unknown chapter. But many people in the United States began to wonder, well, what would we uncover here if we go out and look at the grounds of former boarding schools? And I was telling Andy yesterday that, in fact, our tribal chairman in Minnesota said, well, what's going on? We have some former boarding schools, the Pipestone School. We have another former boarding school in Minnesota. Do we need to go out there with our equipment and see what's on the grounds? And so they called me in to talk to them about boarding school history. I talked to all the tribal chairmen of the 11 federally recognized tribes, the Ojibwe people up north and the Dakota people down south, and I talked about boarding school history. And my answer was, this is not shocking to me because I've been looking at the boarding school records for many decades, and children did indeed die in boarding school. And in fact, the late 19th and early 20th century was a kind of terrible era, and most of the Indian students actually died of tuberculosis, right? Which was a huge problem in the government boarding schools. So I also want to say that not just me with my work that resulted in boarding school seasons, but there have been other Native scholars over the decades who have done work on the history of Indian education. And we've all tried to call attention to the large numbers of students who died in the Indian schools. And also, this was the first time I'd ever heard of the influenza pandemic of 1918, 1920, because there were so many children who got sick and died of that pandemic who were in the kind of communal atmosphere of boarding school. So the death rates for Native students were very high during that global pandemic a century ago. And so you probably remember, too, what we've said about that pandemic a century ago is that what made that particularly terrible for people is that young people in the prime of their lives died in that epidemic. And, it was just kind of the opposite story with COVID and our recent experience with a global pandemic, that older people were more vulnerable. But imagine how different the recent one would have been if we were all worried about 20-year-old people, And so it was really a terrifying and terrible time in the boarding schools because of all the students who were sick and who died in that global pandemic. And in fact, Andy mentioned my documentary that I did a couple of years ago. I'd done an exhibit about the history of the Ojibwe jingle dress dance tradition, which is kind of spread throughout Indian country, but began in the Great Lakes with Ojibwe women. And I came to find out a few years ago, just through finally figuring this out, that healing tradition came out of the aftermath of the epidemic a century ago. And so it's just, we don't always know, like here we are, we can say, well, you've lived through a pandemic, what's the result of that? We don't always know. And so here, Ojibwe women were so affected by this that they created a whole new healing tradition, one that's still with us a century later. Now, when I was being inundated with calls from newspaper reporters a couple summers ago, the local news, people in New York, everyone wanted to know about boarding school history all of a sudden. And I'm always very careful to kind of point out that there are some very big differences between our history of Indian education in the US and the history of the residential schools in Canada, even though they originated in the kind of same colonial project, one that imposed private property rights and Christianity on Indigenous people. But it's important to note that the two systems differed in design and scope. And so this is kind of what I was wanting to talk about a couple of years ago when this conversation was very everywhere. So one big difference is that in Canada, the Canadian government farmed out Indian education to the church organizations. And so the Catholic Church, the Episcopal Church, and there's a Protestant denomination we don't have in the US that they have in Canada, I can never remember the name of. Those were the institutions that were in charge of Indian education in Canada. And so many of the stories about Indian education that have come out of Canada sounded very much like to me the stories that we've heard about when we've learned more about abuse of children who attended Catholic schools in the US, because the religious organizations were in charge of these schools. That wasn't the case in the United States, where teachers and staff from the Indian School Service, some of whom were American Indians, worked in government boarding schools. And so there is a different history. I'm not trying to say there's no abuse, there are no bad things that ever happened in US schools, but there is a kind of there's some fundamental differences in kind of policy making. And then the other big issue that was different from Canada in the United States that I always have to point out as a historian, and I've kind of made the argument, in fact, that we should probably look at boarding school history as generational, right? What my great-grandpa may have experienced at Carlisle might have been different from my grandmother, and certainly was different from, say, the generation who went through the Great Depression. The Great Depression was actually the highest enrollment in Indian schools in the United States took place during the Great Depression. And it was primarily at the request of Indian families who wanted a form of poverty relief during the Great Depression. And so that's why I kind of talked about boarding school history through up to 1940, because the Great Depression to me was a really important era, somewhat different than the other somewhat different than the earlier years. In Canada, then, residential schools continued for another half century after their assimilation model counterparts in the United States began to close in the 1930s. So the other kind of weird thing is that as the boarding schools are, there's all this request from Native families to enroll their children, the schools are starting to close down because the federal government had by this time turned away from the concept of boarding schools. John Collier was head of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Franklin Roosevelt was the president of the United States, and there were a lot of progressive educators who really disliked the boarding school as an institution. John Collier called them medieval institutions. So that's another thing that we sometimes forget, is that the government had turned away from the boarding school policy by the time of, I think, the 1920s, even though there are a lot of Indians in boarding schools because of the Great Depression. But the government had turned away from them. But we shouldn't forget the politics behind that. And this is the other point I kind of wanted to make, talking to reporters and others, and even our tribal chairman in Minnesota. We should never forget that the schools in the United States had a very specific purpose. They helped the United States acquire Indian land. So, to me, that's what the boarding school era is all about. I think some people had very sincere ideas about wanting to educate children, and so forth, but we have to remember that they helped the government acquire Indian lands. And at the beginning of the boarding school era, which I usually date from the establishment of Carlisle in 1879, Indian people, especially in the West, the Great Lakes in the West, still had a considerable amount of real estate. And the United States and places, the states, Minnesota, where I lived, wanted to get their hands on the land that Indian people were still in possession of. And so, look behind the rhetoric, just like you're looking behind the rhetoric of what, this institution was trying to do for Indians. The rhetoric of the boarding school era and assimilation is, we want citizenship, we want them to become Christians and speak English and enter American society and get jobs. All these things were being promised. But behind the rhetoric is the desire for Indian land. And that's what we should never forget about the boarding school era. The boarding school policy went hand in hand with the General Allotment Act of 1887, what we in Minnesota call the Nelson Act, because we had our own particular legislation about allotment. So beginning with Carlisle in 1879 and ending with the Wahpeton School in North Dakota may have been the last of the boarding schools that opened in 1906, the U.S. government operated 25 off-reservation boarding schools. At the same time, during this exact same period, a massive dispossession took place in the form of the General Allotment Act, which authorized the president to survey and divide Indian lands, and they were to kind of re-educate Indian youth who would no longer have a tribal homeland. They wouldn't need a tribal homeland anymore, right? They're gonna move into the cities, they're gonna get jobs, they're gonna do all these things. But the schools were supposed to re-educate the youth who would no longer have a tribal homeland. And so people say to me, do you think boarding schools were genocidal, And I always say yes, but perhaps not for the same reason that it has been generally talked about, because I really don't think the schools were trying to kill children. They were trying to re-educate the children. And the genocidal part of this were the land policies that went hand in hand with the boarding schools. So to me, the genocide is in the land policies that Native people were living through and struggling with in the late 19th and the early 20th century. The schools were motivated by greed, and humanitarian language about assimilating Indians ran very deep. Politicians said Indian tribal life is obsolete, our ancestors needed citizenship and American values of individualism. And so young people in these schools were being trained in agricultural or industrial work as their homelands were being carved up and sold. Like most boarding schools, my grandmother was sent to work as a domestic servant in a white household in boarding school. They were, of course, English-only environments, which damaged our languages as well as our cultural institutions. And Native people were so hard up during the early 20th century that they started to, ironically, use boarding schools as a form of poverty relief. And so when you look at this man's letter, I've lost my wife, I have 6 children. When I'm going working out, it's hard for them. And this is all I ask, if you have a place for them. It's not hard to see what his issues are, right? He's telling you what his issues are. By the 1930s, the United States had pretty much accomplished what it had set out to do at the beginning of the assimilation era. That is, control reservation properties and turn them over to white landowners. And as I mentioned, my grandfather, twice dispossessed, my grandfather was forced from his home on the Mille Lacs Reservation to White Earth, where the state of Minnesota then illegally took his allotment, allowing the timber companies to clear cut the white pine and the forests. So there was a lot of suffering for Native people during this era, and that's what I tried to write about a long time ago when I was working on boarding school seasons. I wanted Indian people to tell their stories of education and what it was like for them. And so sometimes this involved listening to what their parents were talking about and their struggles, and sometimes it was the students themselves, or sometimes it was even the school superintendents, like this letter. Dear sir, it's with a feeling of sorrow I write you telling of the death of your daughter, Lizzie. She was not sick but a short time, and we did not think her so near her end. Tuberculosis was such a problem for Native people in this era that the government considered establishing boarding schools just for those with tuberculosis in the late 19th or in the early 20th century. So why did boarding schools, here's the Society of American Indians, nice picture. Why did boarding schools, this is a graveyard at Haskell, why did boarding schools start, why did the government move away then from boarding schools in the 1930s? Why did the policy decline at that time? And what I would suggest to you is that the United States had pretty much accomplished what it set out to do at the beginning of the assimilation era. That is, control reservation properties and turn them over to white landowners. So, progressive educators at the time, the folks like John Collier, who were kind of cultural pluralists, suddenly found very little resistance to integration. Everybody was like, send Indians to public school. Why not? It'll be great. By the time then of Roosevelt's presidency, even the bureaucrats disparaged the boarding schools. Many of them began to close, and some of them stayed open, but as I suggest to you, it had a lot to do with the problems of the Great Depression. These underfunded schools continued to exploit student labor, which included farm work, baking, sewing, laundry, tasks that allowed the schools to operate. But they adopted more modern educational policies that really weren't from the assimilation model, encouraging students to visit home, see their families. And when I looked at the records of schools like Flandreau, this trickled down into the policies of the boarding school. You know, there weren't people who were kind of remnants of the older assimilation years who were running the schools any longer. But like I said, by the 1930s, the damage was pretty much complete for Native people. The boarding school system yielded a surprising continuum of experiences among students, I should say. Some students were abused and suffered. Some tolerated school. Some found happiness or refuge in boarding schools. I often didn't know what to do with the letters of students who loved their school, right? I was sometimes more troubled by their letters than the students who had negative experiences. I didn't know what to make of it. And when we did this exhibit at the Heard Museum about boarding school history, we tried to acknowledge that vast continuum of experience. There was no single experience that we can all say, yes, this is what happened to Indians who attended government boarding schools. My own grandmother talked about the friendship she made, and she and other students, most of whom I encountered in letters and documents, made it impossible for me to view this history as one of simple victimization. And so what I also saw in the boarding school records is that students, even young children, resisted school policies continuously. They ran away, they burned down buildings, they staged protests, and they were very feisty boarding school students. So, and what I also was so impressed with was the families who, even though they may have lived 100 miles away or more, parented as best they could, kept in touch with officials to challenge boarding school policies. They were always writing to check on their children, and they wrote lots of letters to negotiate with school administrators about the return of their children for summer vacation, or if something had happened in the family, like a funeral or something. And after reading hundreds and hundreds of boarding school letters, the main takeaway for me was never to underestimate American Indian families, even during these difficult years. I found this is my grandmother's letter that I found in the boarding school records. Oh no, this is my great-grandfather, the one that you saw in the football picture. He wrote asking to send his daughter home for the summer, my grandmother, Jeanette. And so the first time I ever saw my great-grandfather's handwriting was in the National Archives. So what I'm kind of left with then is it's impossible to kind of reduce this complex history to a single universal narrative. Many Indian people today, I notice, invoke the broad concept of the boarding school as a way to perhaps build a shared past, linking tribal people of diverse backgrounds to a devastating common history. So perhaps I suggest to you, like the Trail of Tears or Wounded Knee, the boarding school is symbolic of American colonialism at its most genocidal. The system coincided with the end of the Indian Wars. The oldest and best known school, Carlisle, was once a military establishment, and boarding schools, of course, aligned federal authority with the zealotry of religious missions. They depended on national and local authorities, including police at times, to remove children from their parents. They suppressed Indian cultures while opening the door to alienation from land and the extension of Anglo-American culture into the lives and souls of Indian people. Boarding school, and I've written an article about this if you want to look it up in the Journal of Indian Education, called The Boarding School as Metaphor, where I suggest that boarding school perhaps also functions as a potent metaphor for colonialism itself, in how Indian people today are remembering boarding school. But the Interior Department's investigation might lead to a long-delayed public reckoning, which interests me, prompting the question, how can the United States make amends for a half-century of boarding school? And what I would suggest to you is think about how the boarding school era stripped American Indians of 90 million acres of land. I think we should focus on that 90 million acres of land. There is a way the government can make amends. There are ways for our states to make amends to Indian people for the damage of the boarding school era. My own tribe in northern Minnesota has been asking for the return of a little slice of our upper lake that was illegally taken from us after 1887. We still want it back today. A lot of it's state land. And so this is how I would suggest that we start to make amends for the boarding school era. 90 million acres. And I wrote about that too in the Washington Post if you want to look up this piece too. Thank you very much.